Arthur Bennett sat in his favorite cafe, nestled in the heart of San Francisco. Outside, the city buzzed with its usual hustle, a constant reminder of life's relentless pace. Yet, none of it touched Arthur. The warm glow of the cafe's lights seemed to bounce off his expression, a mix of nostalgia and quiet grief. For over 20 years, he had been haunted by the memory of his late wife, Helena. She had passed away suddenly, leaving Arthur with a chasm that not even his business empire could fill. Every day felt like a repetition of the last: board meetings, social events, dinner parties with colleagues. But at night, when he was alone in his luxurious penthouse, silence was the loudest sound. Arthur's greatest regret was never having children. He often imagined how different life would have been if he had a son or daughter to share stories with, to carry on the legacy he and Helena once dreamed of. On this particular rainy evening, as Arthur nursed a cup of coffee, he looked out the window. The streets, slick with rain, glistened under the glow of streetlights. Suddenly, a figure caught his eye. A young woman with long, damp hair stood huddled under the awning of a pharmacy. Cradled in her arms was a baby, bundled tightly in a worn blanket. Arthur's chest tightened. Normally, he would have looked away, suppressing the flicker of empathy that still managed to stir within him. But tonight was different. Without fully understanding why, he stood, grabbed his coat, and stepped into the cold rain. "Excuse me," he said gently, approaching the young woman. She looked up, eyes wide with surprise. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the $400 he had withdrawn earlier for a charity event. "Take this. Get some food and shelter for you and your baby." The young woman hesitated, as if trying to understand why a stranger would offer such kindness. Then, her eyes softened, and she whispered, "Thank you. I don't know how to repay you." Arthur forced a small smile. "No need," he said, his voice quieter. "Take care of yourself." As he walked away, the image of the woman and her child lingered in his mind, an ache settling in his chest. Something in the way she held her baby reminded him of Helena, of a life they never had. He shook off the thought, but the unease clung to him long after he returned to the warmth of his home. The next morning, Arthur's routine took him, as it often did, to the cemetery where Helena was buried. It was a place both painful and comforting, where he spoke to her headstone as if she were still listening. Today, the sky was gray, matching the somber mood that followed him like a shadow. As he approached the grave, he noticed someone there. The same young woman from the night before. She was kneeling in front of Helena's headstone, the baby in her arms. Her shoulders shook as though she were weeping. Arthur stopped, his heart pounding. What could this mean? Why was she here? A surge of confusion and a hint of fear swept over him. Summoning his courage, he stepped closer. "Excuse me," he said, his voice hesitant but firm. The woman turned, startled. Her eyes were red and swollen, and she quickly wiped her face with the back of her hand. "I'm sorry," she stammered. "I didn't mean to intrude." Arthur's gaze shifted from her to the name engraved on the stone. "You were outside the pharmacy yesterday," he said, trying to piece together this strange coincidence. "Why are you here?" The young woman looked down at the baby, a fleeting moment of vulnerability crossing her face. Then, with a trembling voice, she said words that would change everything Arthur thought he knew. "She was my mother." Arthur felt the ground shift beneath him. Arthur froze, staring at the young woman as if her words had echoed incorrectly in his mind. Helena, her mother? It was impossible. Yet, the conviction in her voice, the raw emotion in her eyes, made him pause. His thoughts scrambled, searching for logic in the chaos her revelation had stirred. "You're mistaken," Arthur said finally, his voice steadier than he felt. "Helena never had a child. She would have told me." The woman, still kneeling with her baby cradled in her arms, shook her head slowly. "I'm not mistaken," she said, her voice soft but resolute. "Helena Bennett was my mother. My name is Clara." Arthur's knees felt weak, and he instinctively reached for the headstone to steady himself. He stared at the young woman, his mind flooded with memories of Helena. Her laughter, the warmth of her touch, the way she'd look at him with a mixture of love and secrets she never quite spoke aloud. Could it be possible that she had hidden something so monumental from him? Clara, he repeated, as if trying to make sense of the name. If what you're saying is true, then why didn't she tell me? Why didn't I know? Clara glanced at the baby in her arms, her lips trembling as she began to explain. I didn't know either, not until recently. I was adopted as a baby. My parents told me very little about my biological mother, but they gave me a name, Helena Bennett. It wasn't until a few months ago that I started digging into her life. That's how I found out where she was buried. Arthur's chest tightened as her words sank in. His mind rebelled at the idea of Helena keeping such a profound secret from him. I need proof, he said, his voice trembling with a mix of doubt and desperation. If what you're saying is true, I need to understand. I need to know why. Clara nodded, reaching into her bag and pulling out an envelope. I brought this, she said, handing it to him. It's a letter I found among the few things left by my adoptive parents. It's written by her. Helena. Arthur took the envelope, his hands trembling. The handwriting on it was unmistakable, Helena's elegant script. With a deep breath, he opened it and began to read. Arthur, I've rewritten this letter more times than I can count, and I still don't know if I'll ever send it to you. By the time you read this, if you ever do, everything may be different, or maybe nothing will be. There's something I never told you, something I've carried alone. I was pregnant. I was terrified. I thought about telling you so many times, but I remembered how once, years ago, you said children didn't fit the life we wanted to build. I thought I was protecting you, protecting us. I convinced myself that this was the best way. But now, as I sit here writing, I feel the weight of my choice. I wonder if I was wrong, if I robbed us both of something we could have cherished. If you're reading this, I hope you can forgive me. With all my love, Helena. Arthur's hands fell to his sides as the letter slipped to the ground. His vision blurred, Helena's words a storm of guilt, love, and regret. She had been pregnant. She had carried this secret, made this choice, and left him in the dark. His chest ached as though a piece of his heart had been ripped away all over again. I didn't know, Arthur whispered, almost to himself. She never told me. Clara picked up the letter, holding it gently as she watched Arthur grapple with the revelation. I didn't come here to hurt you, she said quietly. I needed answers, and I thought you might need them too. Arthur looked at her, seeing now the traces of Helena in her features, the curve of her jaw, the spark in her eyes. It was undeniable. This was Helena's daughter, his daughter. The realization hit him like a tidal wave, sweeping away his disbelief and leaving only the raw truth. He had a child, and now, standing before him, holding a child of her own, was his grandson. What's his name? Arthur asked, his voice barely audible. Gabriel, Clara replied, glancing down at the baby, who was now dozing peacefully in her arms. He's 6 months old. Arthur took a step closer, his gaze fixed on the tiny bundle. For the first time in decades, a new kind of ache filled his chest, one of longing and possibility. Gabriel was a connection to Helena, to a life he hadn't even known existed. May I? He hesitated, unsure how to ask. May I hold him? Clara hesitated for only a moment before nodding. She carefully placed Gabriel in Arthur's arms, her movements tender and deliberate. Arthur held the baby, his large hands cradling the small, warm weight. Gabriel stirred briefly, then settled, his tiny fist clutching Arthur's finger. Arthur's throat tightened as tears welled in his eyes. For so long, he had believed his life was defined by loss, by the absence of Helena. But now, here was something new, something precious, fragile, and undeniably his. He looked at Clara, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know how to make up for all the time we've lost, he said, but I want to try. If you'll let me, I want to be part of your life. Both of your lives. Clara's eyes glistened with tears as she nodded. I think we'd like that, she said softly. In that moment, as the rain continued to fall softly around them, Arthur felt something he hadn't felt in years, a spark of hope. It wasn't the life he had planned, but perhaps it was a second chance to find the happiness he thought he'd lost forever. Arthur spent the following days replaying the events at the cemetery in his mind. His encounter with Clara and Gabriel felt both surreal and transformative. For years, his life had been defined by grief and the shadow of Helena's memory. Now, with Clara's arrival, that shadow had shifted, bringing with it rays of light and the faint promise of something new. Connection, family, and purpose. But Arthur also felt uncertainty. He had no idea how to navigate a relationship with a daughter he had just met, let alone become a grandfather. The thought was daunting, yet it stirred something in him he hadn't felt in decades: hope. A week later, Arthur invited Clara to meet him at a small, quiet park near his home. It was a place he often visited when he needed to think, surrounded by lush greenery and the gentle hum of the city in the background. Clara agreed, and as Arthur sat on a bench under the shade of an old oak tree, he spotted her approaching with Gabriel in a stroller. Clara's cautious smile mirrored his own hesitation, but Arthur could see a glimmer of openness in her eyes. She was giving him a chance, and he intended to make the most of it. "Thank you for coming," Arthur said as Clara parked the stroller beside the bench and sat down. "I wasn't sure if I should," Clara admitted, her voice quiet but honest. It's all a lot to process." Arthur nodded. "For me too," he said. "I've spent the past week thinking about everything you told me, about Helena, about you. And it's hard to accept that I didn't know, that I wasn't there for you." Clara looked down, her fingers brushing Gabriel's tiny hand. "I don't blame you," she said softly. "She made her choice. But I've spent my whole life wondering why I wasn't enough for her to keep me. And now, finding out about you, it's brought up more questions than answers." Arthur's chest tightened at her words. He had always seen Helena as a beacon of strength and love, but now he realized how fear had guided her choices. "She didn't give you up because you weren't enough," Arthur said, his voice trembling. "I think she was scared. Scared of how I would react, of how it would change everything. But I want you to know that if I had known about you, I would have been there. I would have loved you." Clara's eyes met his, shimmering with unshed tears. "It's hard to believe that sometimes," she said, "but I want to try." For Gabriel, Arthur glanced at the baby, who was wide awake now, his tiny fist gripping the edge of his blanket. A smile tugged at the corners of Arthur's lips. "He's beautiful," he said. "Looks a lot like you." Clara let out a soft laugh. "He has his moments," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "He's my everything." Arthur hesitated, then asked, "Would you let me help? I don't want to intrude, but if there's anything you need, for him or for you, I'd like to be there." Clara studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, she nodded. "Maybe," she said, "but let's start with something simple, like lunch." Over the next few weeks, Arthur and Clara met regularly, taking slow, tentative steps to bridge the gap between them. Lunches turned into walks in the park, and Arthur began spending more time with Gabriel, marveling at every small milestone the baby reached. His first giggle, the way his tiny hands grasped at everything in reach. It was a world Arthur had never imagined being part of, and he found himself cherishing each moment. One afternoon, as they sat on Clara's modest apartment balcony overlooking the city, she shared more about her life. "I grew up in a small town," she said, rocking Gabriel in her arms. "My adoptive parents were good people, but they didn't talk much about where I came from. I didn't ask either. I think I was afraid of what I'd find." Arthur nodded, his hands resting on his lap. "And what about now? Do you still feel afraid?" Clara considered his question. "Not as much," she admitted. "Meeting you has answered some questions, but it's also opened new ones. Like, what kind of relationship we can even have." Arthur's heart ached at the uncertainty in her voice. "We can have whatever relationship you want," he said earnestly. "I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." For the first time, Clara smiled fully. "I think I'd like that." One evening, Arthur decided to take a bold step. He invited Clara and Gabriel to his home for dinner. It was the first time he had opened his personal space to someone in years, and he wanted them to feel welcome. Clara arrived holding Gabriel, and her eyes widened as she took in the sprawling penthouse. "This place is incredible," she said. Arthur chuckled, feeling slightly self-conscious for the first time. "It's just a home," he said. but it's too big for one person. Maybe it will feel warmer with both of you here." The evening was filled with easy conversation and laughter, a stark contrast to the quiet solitude Arthur had grown used to. As he watched Clara feed Gabriel, a profound sense of gratitude washed over him. This was what he had been missing, a family. As Clara and Gabriel left that night, Arthur stood by the window, watching the city lights twinkle below. For so long, he had believed his life was over, defined by loss and regret. But now, for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't just Arthur Bennett, the businessman. He was a father, a grandfather. And though the road ahead would be challenging, he was ready to embrace it with open arms. The months that followed brought a rhythm Arthur had never known. He became a fixture in Clara and Gabriel's lives, no longer an outsider, but someone they could rely on. Clara's hesitance began to melt away, replaced by a quiet trust that grew with each encounter. For Arthur, every moment spent with them felt like a small piece of his heart being restored. He cherished the laughter that filled their meetings, the milestones Gabriel reached, and the way Clara's guarded demeanor softened with time. One crisp autumn morning, Clara invited Arthur to join her at the park for Gabriel's first time on the swings. Arthur arrived early, nervous but eager. He had always prided himself on his confidence in boardrooms and negotiations, yet these simple family moments left him feeling vulnerable, unsure of his place. When Clara arrived, bundled in a coat with Gabriel in her arms, she waved, her smile bright against the backdrop of golden leaves. Arthur took Gabriel from her carefully, his hands steady but his heart racing. Gabriel, now more alert and curious, reached out for Arthur's glasses, giggling as his small fingers brushed the lenses. Clara laughed, a sound Arthur was growing fond of, and the three of them made their way to the swings. Arthur pushed Gabriel gently, his small feet kicking with delight as he let out peals of laughter that seemed to echo in Arthur's soul. It was a sound that reminded him of hope, a sound he hadn't realized he'd been waiting for. Afterward, they sat on a bench near the pond, watching the ducks glide across the still water. Clara turned to Arthur, her expression contemplative. "You've been amazing with him," she said. "I wasn't sure how this would go when we first met, but I'm glad we gave it a chance." Arthur nodded, his throat tightening with emotion. "I am too," he said. "I didn't know what to expect either, but being here, being part of this, it's more than I ever thought I'd have again." Clara studied him for a moment, then spoke softly. "I've been thinking about what this all means, for us, for Gabriel. I want him to grow up knowing he's loved and supported, and I think you can be a big part of that. If you want to." Arthur's heart swelled. He reached out, covering Clara's hand with his. "I do," he said firmly. "I want to be here for him, and for you. I know I can't make up for the time we lost, but I want to be present now. Whatever you need, I'll be there." Tears glistened in Clara's eyes, but she smiled. "I'd like that. I think Gabriel would too." As they walked back to their cars, Arthur felt a sense of contentment he hadn't experienced in years. The park, the swings, Clara's words, they were signs that he was finally building something meaningful. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that he could be more than a businessman with a past full of regrets. He could be a grandfather, a father, and maybe even a friend to Clara. One evening, Clara invited Arthur to her apartment for dinner. He arrived with a bouquet of flowers and a small toy truck for Gabriel, nervous but excited to spend more time with them. The apartment was cozy and warm, filled with signs of a life built on love. Toys were scattered on the living room floor, and the scent of home-cooked lasagna filled the air. Arthur took it all in, feeling a pang of regret for the years he hadn't been part of this. Dinner was lively, with Gabriel babbling happily in his high chair and Clara sharing stories about her childhood. Arthur listened intently, savoring every detail, every glimpse into the life he hadn't known. After they ate, Clara handed Gabriel to Arthur, asking if he'd like to read him a bedtime story. Arthur hesitated for a moment, then nodded, taking Gabriel into his arms. In Gabriel's small room, Arthur settled into a rocking chair, holding the baby close. He opened a brightly colored book and began to read, his voice soft and measured. Gabriel's eyes fluttered, his tiny fingers clutching Arthur's shirt. By the time the story ended, Gabriel was fast asleep, his head resting against Arthur's chest. Arthur sat there for a moment longer, overwhelmed by a quiet joy. This, he realized, was what he had been missing all along. When Arthur returned to the living room, Clara was cleaning up the dishes. He stepped in to help, drying plates as she washed. They worked in comfortable silence until Clara spoke. "You're good with him," she said. "Better than I expected." Arthur smiled. "He makes it easy," he said. "He's an incredible little boy." Clara looked at him, her expression soft. "Thank you for being here, for trying. I know this hasn't been easy, but it means a lot to me." Arthur placed the dish towel down, his voice steady. "You and Gabriel mean a lot to me too. I want to be part of this, Clara. Not just for him, but for you as well." Clara nodded, her eyes shining. "We're figuring it out, aren't we?" "We are," Arthur said, his heart full. For the first time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The winter months settled in, bringing a crisp chill to the city and a sense of anticipation to Arthur's life. Clara and Gabriel had become a regular part of his days, and their presence filled his once-empty schedule with warmth and purpose. What began as cautious meetings had grown into something deeper. Arthur found himself eagerly planning outings to the zoo, afternoons baking cookies in Clara's kitchen, and evenings reading to Gabriel until the baby's gentle snores filled the room. One morning, as Arthur stood in his penthouse staring out at the city blanketed in frost, his phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text from Clara. The message was simple. "Would you like to come over for Gabriel's first Christmas tree decorating today?" Arthur smiled, his heart swelling. He quickly typed back, "I wouldn't miss it." Later that day, he arrived at Clara's apartment, carrying a box of ornaments he had retrieved from storage. These were items he hadn't touched in decades, memories of holidays spent with Helena. He hesitated as he handed the box to Clara, unsure if revisiting these mementos would be welcome, but she smiled warmly. "These are beautiful," she said as she opened the lid, holding up a delicate glass ornament shaped like a star. "Gabriel will love these." Arthur joined her by the tree, which stood in the corner of the room, its branches full and fragrant. Gabriel sat nearby in his playpen, babbling happily as Clara handed him a soft, unbreakable ornament to examine. Arthur knelt beside the tree, helping Clara string the lights as Gabriel watched with wide eyes. The room glowed with the soft, twinkling light, and for a moment, Arthur felt a pang of emotion. It was the kind of scene he had longed for, but never imagined he'd experience. As they hung the ornaments together, Clara paused to show Arthur a small wooden angel she had made as a child. "This was from when I was 6, she said, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "I always loved making decorations with my adoptive mom." Arthur studied the angel, its hand-painted features slightly smudged but charming. "It's lovely," he said. "We should put it at the center." Clara smiled, and they carefully placed it on the tree together. Gabriel, fascinated by the sparkling lights, reached out from his playpen, and Arthur chuckled. "Looks like someone's eager to help." Clara lifted Gabriel, holding him close to the tree. Arthur handed the baby a small red bauble, which he immediately tried to put in his mouth. They both laughed, gently redirecting him to hang it on a low branch. The simple act of decorating the tree became a memory Arthur knew he'd treasure forever. As the evening wore on, Clara made hot chocolate, and they sat together on the couch, Gabriel nestled between them. The tree twinkled in the corner, casting a warm glow over the room. Clara turned to Arthur, her expression thoughtful. "I've been meaning to ask," she began. "What were your Christmases like with Helena?" Arthur hesitated. It was a tender subject, but Clara's curiosity was genuine. "They were quiet," he said after a moment. "Helena loved the holidays, but we never had children to share them with. We would decorate a tree, exchange gifts, and sometimes take a trip, but I think she always wanted more. Something like this." Clara nodded, her gaze dropping to Gabriel. "It's funny," she said softly. "I spent so many years wondering about her, what she was like. And now, hearing about her from you, it feels like I'm piecing together a part of myself." Arthur reached over, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Helena would have been so proud of you," he said. "And I know she would have adored Gabriel." Clara smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I hope so," she said. "I think about her a lot, especially now that I'm a mom. I wonder what advice she would have given me, what kind of grandmother she would have been." "She would have been extraordinary," Arthur said firmly. "And you are too, Clara." They sat in silence for a while, sipping their hot chocolate as Gabriel drifted to sleep in Clara's arms. Arthur felt a deep sense of peace wash over him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. The ache of the past still lingered, but it no longer defined him. In its place was something new: love, connection, and the beginnings of a family he thought he'd never have. As the night drew to a close, Arthur helped Clara clean up, gathering stray ribbons and scraps of wrapping paper. Before he left, Clara handed him a small gift, wrapped neatly in red paper with a silver bow. "It's nothing big," she said, her cheeks pink. "Just something I thought you might like." Arthur opened it carefully, revealing a framed photo of him holding Gabriel at the park. His throat tightened as he looked at the picture, the joy on his face so clear. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This means more to me than you know." Clara smiled. "You've given us so much, Arthur. I just wanted to give you something back." As he left that evening, the framed photo tucked securely under his arm, Arthur felt a warmth spreading through him that no holiday fire could replicate. For years, he had believed his life would always be defined by what he'd lost. But now, as he walked through the cold, starlit streets, he realized he had gained something far greater: a second chance at family, love, and belonging. The new year arrived with a quiet sense of hope for Arthur. His once sterile apartment now held reminders of his evolving relationship with Clara and Gabriel. A toy truck sat on the coffee table, a soft blanket, Gabriel's favorite, draped over a chair, and a small calendar Clara had gifted him hung by the kitchen. It was marked with handwritten notes: "Park with Gabriel," "Lunch at Clara's," "Gabriel's checkup." For the first time in years, Arthur's days were filled with purpose beyond boardrooms and business deals. One Saturday morning, Clara called and asked if Arthur would join her and Gabriel for a visit to a small farmer's market on the edge of the city. He agreed eagerly, arriving early to help Clara load Gabriel into his stroller. The market was bustling, full of cheerful chatter and the aroma of freshly baked bread and roasted coffee. Arthur felt a sense of novelty in the experience, something so simple, yet so grounding. As they strolled through the market, Clara pointed out stalls she loved. She lingered at one selling handmade toys, picking up a small wooden train for Gabriel. Arthur watched her, marveling at her ease in this environment. She seemed so natural, so confident as a mother. It struck him again how much he had missed, but instead of letting regret take hold, he allowed himself to be present in the moment. At a stall offering fresh flowers, Clara paused and picked up a bouquet of white lilies. Arthur's breath caught for a moment. They had been Helena's favorite. Clara noticed his reaction and hesitated. "Were these something she liked?" she asked gently. Arthur nodded, his voice soft. They were her favorite. She used to keep a vase of them on the table during spring. Clara smiled and added the bouquet to her bag. "Then we should bring some home," she said. "For her." The words warmed Arthur's heart. Clara, in her quiet way, was finding ways to honor Helena while building their new connection. It felt like a bridge between the past and the present, something neither of them had expected but both were learning to embrace. Later that afternoon, they returned to Clara's apartment, their arms full of produce and small treasures from the market. Gabriel, worn out from the outing, napped peacefully in his crib as Arthur and Clara prepared lunch together. The small kitchen buzzed with activity as they chopped vegetables and laughed over Gabriel's antics earlier in the day. As they worked, Clara spoke up, her tone thoughtful. "I've been thinking about Gabriel's future," she said, "about what kind of life I want to give him. It's been hard doing it alone." Arthur stopped chopping and turned to her. "You're not alone anymore, Clara," he said. "I'm here. Whatever you need, for you or for Gabriel, I want to help." Clara looked at him, her expression a mixture of gratitude and vulnerability. "I know you mean that," she said, "and it means a lot to me. It's hard to let go of the idea that I have to do everything on my own. I've been doing it for so long." Arthur nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "It's hard to accept help sometimes," he said. "I've spent most of my life trying to handle everything alone too. But I've learned that it's okay to lean on the people who care about you. That's what family is for." Clara smiled softly and reached out to squeeze his hand. "Thank you, Arthur, for being here, for trying." The afternoon passed in a blur of shared meals and quiet conversations. As evening fell, Arthur found himself sitting on the couch, Gabriel nestled in his arms. The baby had woken from his nap full of energy, babbling happily as Arthur played peekaboo. Clara watched from the doorway, her arms crossed and a contented smile on her face. It was a picture of something she hadn't dared to dream of, a family, even if unconventional. When it was time for Arthur to leave, Clara walked him to the door. She hesitated before speaking, her voice tentative. "I've been thinking about something else," she said. "I want Gabriel to know about his grandmother, about Helena. I think it's important he understands where he comes from." Arthur felt a swell of emotion at her words. "I'd like that," he said. "I could share stories, show him pictures, maybe even visit her grave together someday." Clara nodded. "I think she'd like that too." As Arthur stepped out into the cool evening air, he felt a sense of peace that was becoming more familiar. Clara's trust in him was growing, and with it, the bonds of their new family were strengthening. Each day brought new challenges and new joys, but Arthur welcomed them all. Driving home, he thought about the lilies now sitting on Clara's table, the laughter they had shared at the market, and the weight of Gabriel in his arms. It wasn't the life he had envisioned all those years ago, but it was a life he had come to treasure. Helena's legacy lived on, not as a shadow of regret, but as a bridge to a brighter, more hopeful future. The days turned into weeks, and winter began to loosen its grip, giving way to the soft promise of spring. Arthur found himself looking forward to each day in a way he hadn't in years. His mornings often began with a text from Clara, a picture of Gabriel with a cheeky grin, or a quick message inviting him to join them for lunch or a walk. He had become an integral part of their lives, not just a visitor or an occasional presence, but someone they could rely on. One Sunday morning, Clara called with an invitation that both excited and intimidated Arthur. She wanted him to come along to a community picnic, a small gathering organized by her neighborhood. It was the first time Clara had asked him to join her in a public setting with other families, and Arthur felt a pang of nervousness. He wasn't sure how he'd fit in, but he couldn't say no. When he arrived at the park, Clara was waiting near a large oak tree with Gabriel perched on her hip. She waved, and Arthur felt his apprehension ease. He walked over, greeted with Gabriel's excited babbling and Clara's warm smile. The park was alive with activity. Children running through the grass, families setting up picnic blankets, and the aroma of grilled food wafting through the air. Clara led him to a shaded spot where she had spread out a colorful blanket. Gabriel was already reaching for a small toy car, his tiny fingers fumbling with its wheels. Arthur sat beside him, quickly falling into the easy rhythm of entertaining the baby while Clara unpacked sandwiches and snacks. For a moment, it felt almost ordinary, as if this kind of scene had been part of his life forever. As the day unfolded, Clara introduced Arthur to some of her neighbors. They were kind and welcoming, asking Arthur questions about his life and marveling at how good he was with Gabriel. It felt strange but comforting to be included in this circle, a reminder that he was building something real with Clara and her son. At one point, Clara excused herself to get drinks, leaving Gabriel in Arthur's care. As Arthur held the baby, he noticed another older man approach, a neighbor who had been playing with his own grandchildren nearby. The man smiled and nodded at Arthur. "You're a lucky man," he said. "Grandkids are the best, aren't they?" Arthur paused, the word grandkids hanging in the air. It felt both foreign and profoundly right. He smiled back, his voice steady. "They are. He's a special little guy." The man chuckled. "They keep us young. Enjoy every moment." Arthur watched as the man walked away, his words settling deep into his heart. For years, Arthur had felt the weight of time pressing down on him, but now, in Gabriel's laughter and Clara's trust, he felt something new: renewal, purpose, and the possibility of making up for lost time. When Clara returned, holding 2 glasses of lemonade, she sat beside Arthur, her eyes scanning the scene around them. "You're good at this," she said, her tone light but sincere. "Good at what?" Arthur asked, glancing at her with a smile. "This. Being part of it all. Being with us." Arthur felt a lump rise in his throat. He looked down at Gabriel, who was now dozing lightly against his chest, his small hand clutching Arthur's shirt. "It means everything to me," he said. "More than I can put into words." Clara's expression softened, and for a moment, there was a comfortable silence between them. The warmth of the sun, the laughter of children, and the soft breeze felt like a balm to Arthur's soul. It wasn't just a picnic. It was a moment of belonging, a glimpse of the life he never thought he'd have. As the day wound down and the crowd began to disperse, Clara packed up their things while Arthur carried a now-sleeping Gabriel to the car. They drove back to Clara's apartment, the baby still soundly asleep in his car seat. When they arrived, Arthur helped carry everything inside and stayed for a while, sitting with Clara at the kitchen table as Gabriel napped. "I've been thinking," Clara said, breaking the comfortable silence, "about how far we've come since we met at the cemetery. It feels surreal sometimes." Arthur nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "It does, but it also feels right. Like this is where I'm supposed to be." Clara smiled, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee mug. "I think Mom would have wanted this," she said quietly, "for us to find each other. For Gabriel to have you in his life." Arthur's chest tightened, a mix of gratitude and longing washing over him. "I think so too," he said. "I think she'd be proud of you, of the life you've built." Clara's eyes shimmered with emotion. "I'm glad we found this," she said. "I didn't think I needed anyone, but now I can't imagine doing this without you." Arthur reached across the table, placing his hand over hers. "You're not alone anymore," he said. "We're in this together." As the evening wore on, Arthur stayed until Gabriel woke up, the baby's cheerful babbling filling the room once again. When it was time to leave, Arthur felt a profound sense of peace. The relationships he was building with Clara and Gabriel weren't just healing his own heart. They were creating a foundation for something lasting and beautiful. As he drove home, the city lights twinkling around him, Arthur felt the weight of the past lifting. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, he embraced it with open arms. The road ahead was theirs to walk together, and he was ready for every step. Spring blossomed fully, painting the city with colors and filling the air with the scent of renewal. Arthur found himself immersed in a life he never imagined he'd have. He was no longer the distant businessman, isolated in his penthouse. Instead, he had become part of something vibrant and real. His relationship with Clara had deepened into a bond built on trust, shared memories, and a mutual understanding of how loss had shaped them both. And Gabriel. He had become the center of Arthur's world, a constant reminder of the joy and hope life could offer, even after years of solitude. One afternoon, Clara called with a request that surprised Arthur. She wanted to plan a small family outing to visit Helena's grave together. Clara explained that she wanted Gabriel to understand where he came from as he grew up, and she felt it was the right time to introduce him to the place that had started their unexpected journey as a family. Arthur, though hesitant, agreed. The idea of returning to the cemetery where he had spent countless lonely days now filled him with a mixture of apprehension and resolve. This time, he wouldn't be alone. The day arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze. Arthur drove to Clara's apartment to pick her and Gabriel up, feeling a knot of emotion tightening in his chest. Clara greeted him at the door, Gabriel perched on her hip, dressed in a tiny collared shirt that made Arthur chuckle despite his nerves. Together, they made their way to the cemetery, the air in the car quiet but comfortable. When they arrived, Arthur led them to Helena's grave, his steps steady but slow. The headstone stood just as it always had, surrounded by well-kept grass and shaded by a large oak tree. He paused in front of it, his eyes tracing the name etched into the stone. For years, this spot had been a place of mourning, a marker of all he had lost. But today, it felt different. Today, it was a place of connection, of honoring the woman who had brought them together in ways none of them could have foreseen. Clara stepped forward, gently placing a bouquet of white lilies, Helena's favorite, on the grave. She knelt, holding Gabriel close, and introduced him softly. "This is your grandmother, Gabriel," she said. "She was kind, strong, and loved deeply. I think she would have loved you very much." Arthur watched, his heart swelling with emotion. He knelt beside Clara, his voice steady as he added, "She would have been so proud of both of you." For a while, they sat in silence, the only sounds the rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. Gabriel, too young to understand the significance of the moment, reached out to touch the grass, his tiny fingers brushing the lilies. Arthur smiled, feeling an unexpected warmth wash over him. This was no longer a place of sorrow. It was a place where the past and present could coexist, where Helena's memory could live on through Clara and Gabriel. As they left the cemetery, Arthur felt lighter than he had in years. The weight of regret and unanswered questions no longer bore down on him the way it once had. He knew he would never have all the answers about Helena's choices, but he also knew he didn't need them anymore. What mattered was the family they had created in her absence, the love and resilience that had grown in the cracks of their shared loss. That evening, back at Clara's apartment, they decided to have dinner together. Arthur helped Clara prepare the meal, their movements around the kitchen becoming more familiar with each passing visit. Gabriel sat in his high chair, babbling happily and occasionally banging a spoon against the tray. It was chaotic, messy, and perfect. As they sat down to eat, Clara raised her glass of water, her eyes sparkling with emotion. "To family," she said simply. Arthur lifted his own glass, his voice filled with conviction. "To family," he echoed. After dinner, Arthur stayed to read Gabriel a bedtime story. It had become a ritual he cherished, one that made him feel closer to both Gabriel and Clara. As he sat in the rocking chair with Gabriel snuggled against him, he opened a book Clara had chosen, its pages filled with colorful illustrations. Gabriel's eyelids grew heavy as Arthur's voice filled the room, and by the time the story ended, the baby was sound asleep. Arthur lingered in the quiet nursery, watching Gabriel's peaceful expression. In that moment, he felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for Gabriel, but for Clara's courage in reaching out to him, for Helena's memory that had brought them together, and for the second chance he had been given to be part of something meaningful. When he returned to the living room, Clara was tidying up, her movements slow and deliberate. She looked up as he entered, offering a tired but genuine smile. "He loves when you read to him," she said. "I think he feels safe with you." Arthur's heart swelled. "I feel the same with him," he admitted. "I never thought I'd have any of this, but it's everything I didn't know I needed." Clara stepped closer, her voice quiet but firm. "You're part of our family now, Arthur. We wouldn't be the same without you." The words settled over him like a warm embrace, solidifying what he had come to understand in the months since meeting Clara and Gabriel. He wasn't just an outsider trying to make amends for lost time. He was home. The weeks following their visit to Helena's grave felt like a turning point for Arthur. He no longer carried the same burden of regret that had followed him for so many years. The moments he spent with Clara and Gabriel began to outweigh the shadows of the past, replacing them with the light of something new and enduring. He found himself waking each day with a sense of purpose, something he had thought was long lost. One evening, as Arthur returned home after a long day of meetings, he found himself reflecting on how much his life had changed. His penthouse, once cold and sterile, now felt warmer. Photos of Gabriel and Clara adorned the shelves, and toys occasionally found their way into corners of the room, left behind after one of Gabriel's visits. The silence that once echoed through the space was now replaced by the promise of family gatherings, laughter, and shared meals. Arthur's phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text from Clara. "We're making cookies tomorrow. Gabriel insists on helping. You in?" Arthur smiled, replying immediately. "Wouldn't miss it. See you at 10. The next morning, Arthur arrived at Clara's apartment with a bag of ingredients in hand. Clara greeted him at the door, flour already dusting her cheeks, and Gabriel was sitting in his high chair, banging a wooden spoon against the tray. The kitchen was a flurry of activity, with bowls, measuring cups, and an array of cookie cutters spread across the counter. "You're just in time," Clara said, grinning as she motioned for him to join them. "Gabriel's ready to be the head chef." Arthur chuckled and rolled up his sleeves. He wasn't much of a baker, but he was eager to dive into the chaos. Gabriel squealed with delight as Arthur helped him press a star-shaped cookie cutter into the dough. Clara laughed as Gabriel's small hands became coated in flour, leaving smudges on his face and the counter. The three of them worked together, and while the cookies weren't perfect, the joy of the moment far outweighed any need for precision. As the cookies baked, filling the apartment with a warm, sugary aroma, they sat together at the table. Gabriel, still excited, waved his spoon like a wand, babbling animatedly. Arthur watched him, marveling at the energy and innocence that radiated from the little boy. He glanced at Clara, who was smiling as she wiped her hands on a dish towel, and felt a surge of gratitude. "You're really good at this," Arthur said, his voice sincere. "At what?" Clara asked, tilting her head. "At being a mom," Arthur replied, "and at making me feel like I belong here." Clara's smile softened. "You do belong here, Arthur. Gabriel loves you. And so do I, in a way I didn't think I could." The words hung in the air, carrying a weight that neither of them had expected. Arthur felt his chest tighten, overwhelmed by the simple yet profound truth in what she'd said. "I love both of you too," he said quietly. "You've given me a second chance at something I thought I'd lost forever." They sat in silence for a moment, the warmth of the kitchen and the connection between them filling the space. It was a quiet acknowledgement of how far they had come, and how much they had come to mean to each other. When the cookies were finally ready, Clara plated them and placed the tray in front of Gabriel, who clapped his hands excitedly. Arthur took a bite, laughing at the uneven edges and overly generous sprinkles. "Not bad for our first attempt," he said, winking at Clara. "Not bad at all," she agreed, handing Gabriel a small piece to nibble on. The rest of the day was spent enjoying their creations and playing with Gabriel, whose boundless energy kept them both on their toes. By the time the sun began to set, Arthur felt a sense of contentment he hadn't known in years. As he prepared to leave, Clara walked him to the door, holding Gabriel in her arms. "Thank you for coming," she said. "You make everything better when you're here." Arthur reached out, gently touching Gabriel's tiny hand. "Thank you for letting me be part of this," he said. "I'll see you both soon." As he drove home, the city lights reflecting off the windows of his car, Arthur felt a quiet joy settle over him. He had spent so much of his life focused on building an empire, on filling the void Helena's absence had left. But now, he realized, he had something far greater than wealth or success. He had a family. In the days that followed, Arthur and Clara began discussing the future in earnest. Clara expressed her hopes for Gabriel, her dreams of giving him the best life possible. Arthur listened intently, offering his support and quietly vowing to do everything in his power to make those dreams a reality. They talked about schooling, about trips they might take as Gabriel grew older, and about how they could continue to honor Helena's memory while building a life that was uniquely theirs. One evening, as they sat together after dinner, Clara turned to Arthur with a question that had been on her mind. "Do you ever think about what life would have been like if Mom had told you about me back then?" Arthur considered her words carefully. "I do," he admitted. "But I also think that everything happened the way it was meant to. If she had told me, maybe we wouldn't be here now, like this. And I wouldn't trade this for anything." Clara nodded, her eyes shining with emotion. "Me neither," she said. "I'm glad we found each other, no matter how long it took." As the evening stretched on, they talked late into the night, their bond growing deeper with every shared story and every expression of trust. For the first time in a long time, Arthur felt truly at peace, ready to embrace whatever the future might hold. Together, they had turned the pain of the past into something beautiful, a testament to the power of love, forgiveness, and family. Summer arrived with its long, golden days and warm breezes, and with it came new milestones for Gabriel and the family that Arthur, Clara, and he had built together. Gabriel was taking his first wobbly steps, a feat that filled Arthur with pride every time the little boy tottered toward him with outstretched arms. These moments had become the highlights of Arthur's days, grounding him in a joy he had never fully known. One afternoon, Clara called Arthur with an idea. She wanted to take Gabriel on his first trip to the beach and asked if Arthur would join them. He agreed without hesitation, already imagining the baby's wide-eyed wonder at the sight of the ocean. Clara had grown more comfortable inviting Arthur into her and Gabriel's lives in bigger ways, and this felt like a celebration of how far they'd come. They set off early on a Saturday morning, the car packed with beach towels, umbrellas, and an assortment of toys for Gabriel. Arthur drove, his hands steady on the wheel as Clara sat beside him, feeding Gabriel pieces of fruit from the back seat to keep him entertained. The drive was filled with laughter and easy conversation, the kind that had grown natural between them over the months. When they arrived, the sight of the sprawling ocean took Arthur's breath away. The rhythmic crash of the waves and the vast blue expanse brought a calm he hadn't realized he needed. Gabriel, nestled in Clara's arms, stared wide-eyed at the new world before him. Arthur grabbed the bags, set up the umbrella and blankets, and soon they were settled on the soft sand. Clara laughed as Gabriel reached down, grabbing a fistful of sand and letting it slip through his tiny fingers. Arthur joined them, crouching down to help Gabriel dig with a small plastic shovel. Together, they built a lopsided sandcastle that Gabriel promptly destroyed with a delighted squeal. Arthur laughed, his heart full as he watched Gabriel's joy. After a while, Clara handed Gabriel to Arthur, asking him to hold the baby while she waded into the water. Arthur stood with Gabriel in his arms, watching her as the waves lapped at her ankles. She turned back toward them, waving and smiling, and Arthur felt a pang of gratitude for the life they had created together. It wasn't something he could have predicted, but it had become everything he didn't know he needed. Gabriel babbled in Arthur's arms, pointing toward the water, and Arthur decided to follow Clara's lead. He walked down to the shoreline, holding Gabriel securely as the waves brushed over their feet. The baby let out a squeal of delight, his laughter rising above the sound of the ocean. Arthur chuckled, bouncing Gabriel gently and marveling at the pure joy of the moment. As the day wore on, they shared a simple picnic lunch under the shade of the umbrella, Gabriel's fingers sticky with bits of watermelon as Clara wiped his face with a napkin. Arthur felt the warmth of the sun on his skin and the cool breeze from the ocean, and for the first time in years, he felt completely at ease. After lunch, Clara suggested they take a walk along the shore. Gabriel, growing sleepy, nestled into Arthur's arms as they strolled. The tide ebbed and flowed, leaving shimmering patterns in the sand, and the three of them moved as though they had done this 1,000 times before. Clara talked about her dreams for Gabriel, how she wanted him to grow up surrounded by love and opportunities, how she hoped he would one day understand the importance of family. Arthur listened, his heart swelling with every word. He thought about how far they had come since the day they first met, how the weight of Helena's choices had shifted from something that divided them to something that brought them closer together. He had spent so much time mourning what he didn't have, but now he realized how much he had gained. When they returned to their spot on the beach, Gabriel was sound asleep in Arthur's arms. Clara spread out a blanket, and Arthur carefully laid the baby down, covering him with a light towel to shield him from the sun. They sat side by side, watching the waves roll in, the sound soothing and rhythmic. "I never thought I'd have this," Arthur said quietly after a while. "A second chance at family, at being part of something like this." Clara looked at him, her eyes soft. "Neither did I," she admitted. "But I'm glad we found each other. I'm glad Gabriel has you." Arthur turned to her, his expression full of gratitude. "I hope he knows how much he's loved. How much you're loved." Clara smiled, her hand resting on Arthur's. "I think he'll know, because you're here." They stayed on the beach until the sun began to set, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink. As they packed up to leave, Arthur took one last look at the ocean, feeling its vastness mirrored in his own heart. He had spent years adrift, searching for something he couldn't name, and now he had found it. In Clara and Gabriel, he had found home. On the drive back, Gabriel slept soundly in his car seat, his small face peaceful. Clara leaned her head against the window, her expression serene. Arthur drove with a quiet sense of purpose, knowing that this wasn't just a single day at the beach. It was a piece of the life they were building together, one filled with love, hope, and the promise of a brighter future. The years passed, each one weaving new threads into the tapestry of Arthur's life. The once empty penthouse transformed into a warm, vibrant space filled with reminders of his growing family. The framed photographs lining the shelves told the story of their journey: Gabriel's first birthday, his first day of school, and countless candid moments of laughter and love shared between Arthur, Clara, and the little boy who had brought them together. Arthur had fully embraced his role as a grandfather. Gabriel, now a curious and energetic 5-year-old, idolized him. Every weekend was an adventure, whether they were exploring a local museum, visiting the zoo, or simply building elaborate train tracks on the living room floor. Arthur marveled at the boundless energy and wonder Gabriel brought to every moment. He often thought about how different his life had become, how much richer and fuller it felt now compared to the years he had spent alone. Clara, too, had blossomed in the time they had shared. She had gone back to school, earning a degree in education, and now worked as a teacher at a nearby elementary school. Arthur supported her every step of the way, often stepping in to watch Gabriel when her classes or internships ran late. Watching her grow into her career filled him with pride. Clara's strength and determination reminded him of Helena, and he often found himself wishing Helena could see the remarkable woman their daughter had become. One warm summer evening, Clara hosted a small gathering at her home to celebrate her graduation and the milestones they had achieved together. Friends and neighbors filled the backyard, the air alive with music and laughter. Arthur stood by the grill, flipping burgers while Gabriel zipped around the yard, chasing bubbles with a pack of other children. Clara approached him, holding a plate of snacks in one hand and a glass of lemonade in the other. "You're quite the grill master," she teased, her smile bright. "Everyone's saying these are the best burgers they've ever had." Arthur chuckled, shaking his head. "I think they're just being polite. But I'll take the compliment." She stood beside him for a moment, watching Gabriel play. "It's amazing, isn't it?" she said softly. "How far we've come. I don't know what I would have done without you, Arthur." Arthur turned to her, his expression filled with emotion. "I think we saved each other, Clara. You and Gabriel have given me a life I never thought I'd have." They shared a quiet moment, the noise of the party fading into the background. Arthur reached out and rested a hand on her shoulder. "Your mother would be so proud of you," he said. "Of the life you've built, of the mother you are, of everything you've accomplished." Clara blinked back tears, nodding. "I hope so. I think about her all the time, about what she'd say if she could see us now." "She'd tell you what I already know," Arthur said, "that you're extraordinary." As the night wore on, the guests began to leave, and the backyard grew quiet. Arthur stayed behind to help Clara clean up, gathering empty plates and cups while she put away the leftover food. Gabriel, exhausted from the day's excitement, had fallen asleep on the couch, his favorite blanket tucked around him. When the house was tidy and still, Clara joined Arthur at the kitchen table. They sat together, sipping the last of the lemonade and reflecting on the evening. "Do you ever think about how it all started?" Clara asked, her voice thoughtful. "That night at the cemetery, when everything changed?" Arthur nodded. "I think about it often, how something so unexpected led to this. It feels like fate, in a way. Like Helena brought us together." Clara smiled, her eyes glistening. "I like to think that too, that she's been watching over us, guiding us." Arthur reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "We've been through so much, Clara, but what matters now is the family we've built. I'll never stop being grateful for that." Clara squeezed his hand, her smile warm and steady. "Neither will I." The following morning, Arthur woke early, as he often did, and found himself drawn to the park where he used to go for solace. It was quiet at that hour, the soft light of dawn filtering through the trees. He walked along the path, his thoughts turning to Helena. For years, he had visited her grave in search of answers, carrying the weight of her absence like a heavy shadow. But now, his visits felt different. They were no longer about mourning, but about gratitude. As he sat on a bench overlooking the pond, he thought about the legacy Helena had left behind. It wasn't just in the memories he cherished, but in the family that had grown from her choices. Clara and Gabriel were proof that love could endure, that even in the face of loss, life could rebuild itself in beautiful and unexpected ways. Arthur closed his eyes, letting the peace of the moment wash over him. He had spent so much of his life focused on the things he had lost, But now he understood that life was just as much about what you find. In Clara's smile, in Gabriel's laughter, in the quiet moments they shared, he had found everything he had been searching for. As the sun rose higher, warming the park with its golden light, Arthur stood and began the walk home. His heart was full, his steps steady. The future stretched ahead, bright and open, and for the first time in a long time, Arthur felt ready to embrace it fully. He wasn't just living for himself anymore. He was living for them, for the family they had become and the love that had brought them together.